Widowed Marquis hired a nurse for the night and woke wanting her name. The truth of that statement was a seed of shame planted in the dark soil of Lord Alastair Beaumont's soul, one he had watered with deception. Outside the stone fortress of Blackwood Manor, a relentless autumn rain fell, weeping against the leaded glass as if mourning the light. Inside, Alastair felt the same cold dampness seep into his bones, a familiar companion since the day his world had fractured. He ran a hand over the jagged scar that cut a path from his temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of shattered glass and a life lost. He needed a miracle, but miracles did not come to men like him. So he had settled for a test. A cruel, necessary crucible to find someone of unimpeachable character to save the one person he had left. His daughter. Miles away, in a village huddled against the moor, Elara tended to a child's fever with hands that were chapped from lye soap but moved with the gentle certainty of long practice. She was a healer, a woman who lived in the quiet spaces between life and death, respected but perpetually poor. Her cottage smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, a small bastion of warmth against the encroaching chill. When the Marquis of Blackwood's steward appeared at her door, his cloak dripping onto her clean-swept floor, offering a sum that could feed her for a year to serve as a nurse for a single night, she felt a tremor of disbelief, then suspicion. The Marquis was a ghost, a name whispered with fear. The Beast of Blackwood, they called him, a man scarred and broken by tragedy. But the steward's eyes held a desperate plea, and the coin he offered was not just security. It was survival. She agreed. The carriage ride to the manor was a journey into shadow. The great house rose from the mist like a jagged cliff, its windows' dark eyes staring into nothing. The silence within its walls was a physical weight, heavier than the ornate tapestries and suffocating velvet drapes. Elara followed the steward down a long hall to the Marquis's chambers, her simple wool dress a stark contrast to the gilded gloom. Lord Alastair was not what she had expected. He was not a monster, but a man carved from grief. Tall and severe, the scar on his face was less terrifying than the profound emptiness in his gray eyes. He sat by a low fire, a decanter of brandy at his elbow, and did not rise to greet her. The steward explained the terms, he said, his voice a low rasp. A recurring fever from an old war wound. It will likely break by dawn. You are to watch over me. Nothing more. It was a lie. He felt the falsehood coat his tongue like poison. His true purpose was to observe her, to test her mettle, to see if she was the one who could reach the silent, shattered part of his world he kept hidden away. His first test was a simple, brutish thing. As she prepared a poultice on a nearby table, he gestured dismissively and his hand connected with a delicate porcelain teacup, sending it crashing to the stone floor. It shattered into a dozen pieces. He watched her, his expression a mask of cold indifference, waiting. A lesser woman might have tried to hide the pieces, or wept, or grown flustered. Elara did none of these things. She simply knelt, her movements economical and calm, and carefully gathered the shards into a cloth. "I will inform the steward at once, my lord," she said, her gaze steady and direct. "The cost can be taken from my wages." Her dignity was a quiet, unassailable thing. It was the first crack in his certainty, the first sign that this woman was more than just a subject in his desperate experiment. Later, as the feigned sleep of his fever overtook him, an unwelcome visitor arrived. His cousin, Sir Gideon, a man whose smile was as polished and false as his signet ring, strode into the room unannounced. Alastair, still playing the brooding recluse? Gideon's eyes swept over Elara, a smirk touching his lips. And with village help, no less. How far the mighty have fallen. Alastair's jaw tightened, but he remained still, his eyes closed. The true test of the night was not one he had devised. A genuine tremor took him, not from a manufactured illness, but from the tendrils of a nightmare that clawed at him from the past. The shriek of tearing metal, the smell of blood, the sound of his wife's last whispered word. He cried out, a raw, broken sound that echoed in the cavernous room. Elara was at his side in an instant. She didn't fuss or panic. She laid a cool cloth on his brow, her touch incredibly gentle. "Hush now, my lord," she murmured, her voice a low balm. "You are safe." It is only a dream. He felt the storm inside him recede, soothed not by a sedative, but by the simple, profound calm of her presence. When the last vestiges of the nightmare faded, he opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not a servant to be tested, but a woman of quiet strength, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. In that moment, he felt a flicker of warmth in the frozen landscape of his heart, a terrifying and unfamiliar sensation. Hope. He extended the arrangement. "The fever is stubborn," he'd said, the lie tasting fouler than before. 2 days stretched into 3, then a week. The pretense of his illness became a fragile screen behind which something real and unexpected began to grow. They spoke, at first in stilted sentences across the vast expanse of his chambers, and then, slowly, with more ease. She told him of her life, of the rhythms of the village, of the healing properties of foxglove and willow bark. In return, he found himself speaking of things he had locked away, not the details of the accident, but the crushing weight of the silence it had left behind. "The quiet is the worst part," he confessed one evening, staring into the fire. "It eats everything." "Sometimes quiet isn't empty, my lord," she replied softly. "Sometimes it's just waiting for the right sound." He became fascinated by her hands. He had only ever known the soft, pale hands of aristocratic women, hands that had never known a day of labor. Alara's hands were capable, her fingers deft as she ground herbs or stitched a seam. They were hands that created, that healed. He felt a desperate, shameful urge to feel their touch again, not in the dispassionate context of nursing, but with intent. The guilt of his deception was a constant, grinding stone in his gut. He had set out to find a caretaker for his daughter, and instead, he was in danger of losing his own guarded heart to the subject of his test. The turning point came on a windswept afternoon. Wandering the less frequented corridors of the East Wing, a place Alistair never went, Alara heard a sound, a small, stifled sob from behind a heavy oak door. Pushing it open, she found a child's nursery, shrouded in dust cloths, everything perfectly preserved as if frozen in time. In the center of the room sat a little girl with Alistair's gray eyes and a face of heartbreaking solemnity. She clutched a small, carved wooden bird, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Alara's breath caught. She approached him later, her expression not accusatory, but filled with a deep, aching concern. "You have a child. A daughter." The question stripped him of his defenses. He finally told her part of the truth, his voice rough with unshed grief. "Her name is Rosalie. She has not spoken a word since the accident, since she lost her mother." He led Alara to the nursery, and for the first time, allowed someone else to witness the full scope of his failure. Rosalie looked at Alara with wide, vacant eyes, a ghost haunting her own life. The fragile connection between Alistair and Alara deepened into something stronger, forged in the shared space of his vulnerability. That bond was tested when Sir Gideon, overstaying his welcome, cornered Alara in the walled garden. "A clever little thing, aren't you?" Gideon purred, blocking her path. "Worming your way into my cousin's confidence. Tell me, is he paying you for your nursing skills, or for warmer comforts?" Before Alara could answer, Alistair was there. He moved with a predator's speed, his face a thunderous mask. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "Get off my land, Gideon," he said, the words laced with ice and menace. "And if you ever speak to her again, I will forget we share the same blood." He stood between Alara and his cousin, a furious, protective shield. As Gideon scurried away, Alistair turned to her, his eyes blazing with an emotion that looked terrifyingly like devotion. The charade of his illness dissolved completely. His new, openly stated purpose for her was Rosalie. "Please," he had begged, his pride in tatters, "try to reach her." Alara did not try to force the child to speak. She simply existed in her space. She brought the outside world in, weaving daisy chains on the nursery floor and telling rosily quiet tales of the squirrels and badgers in the woods. She showed the child how to press flowers between the pages of a book, her capable hands guiding Rosalie's small, hesitant ones. For days there was no response. Then, one afternoon, as Alara hummed a simple folk tune, Rosalie reached out and placed her tiny hand over Alara's. It was not a word, but it was a bridge, a beginning. That evening, Alastair watched them from the doorway, his heart a painful knot of hope and regret in his chest. Later, as he and Alara sat by the library fire, the silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with 1,000 unspoken things. He reached across the space separating them, his fingers trembling slightly as he gently traced the line of her knuckles. The air grew thick, charged with a current of longing so powerful it was almost a physical force. "Alara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, ready to confess everything, to tear down the wall of lies between them. But he never got the chance. The truth, when it came, was not a confession but an execution. He was in his study with his steward, the door slightly ajar, the argument heated. "You must tell her, my lord," the steward implored. "This has gone on long enough. The test is over. You have your answer." "It is no longer a test," Alastair retorted, his voice ragged. "It is everything." "Then tell her that, before she learns of the charade from someone else. You cannot build a foundation on such a deceit." From the hallway, where she had been bringing a tray of tea, Alara heard the words. Test, charade, deceit. The porcelain cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a sickening echo of Alastair's earlier, deliberate act. The sound brought both men to the door. They saw her standing there, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a pain so profound it stole the breath from Alastair's lungs. She didn't scream or cry. Her voice, when it came, was a barely audible whisper, yet it flayed him open. "All of it? My entire time here? It was a performance? I was a subject to be observed and judged." She looked from his face to the steward's, the awful comprehension dawning. "Your illness. It was all a lie. Alara, let me explain." But she held up a hand, a gesture that stopped him cold. "There is nothing to explain. There is only the truth you chose to hide." She turned without another word and walked away, her back straight, her dignity the only armor she had against his devastating betrayal. She packed her meager belongings and was gone before the hour was out. The exorbitant fee he had promised lay untouched on the hall table, a glittering insult. The rain returned to Blackwood Manor, lashing against the windows with a furious, relentless sorrow. Alara sat in her small cottage, the scent of herbs now seeming cloying, the warmth of her hearth unable to touch the ice that had formed around her heart. She had allowed herself to see a man, not a Marquis, a soul in pain, not a beast. She had allowed herself to hope. The humiliation was a bitter, physical ache. But as the days passed, the ache slowly hardened into resolve. She was Alara, the village healer. Her worth was not determined by a nobleman's cruel games. She had a life, a purpose that he could not touch. At Blackwood, the silence Alastair had once lamented returned with a vengeance, now amplified by the ghost of Alara's presence. Rosalie, sensing her absence, retreated into her shell, the small wooden bird once again her only companion. The great house was a tomb, and Alastair was its sole, tormented prisoner. He saw his reflection in a dark window, the scar, the haunted eyes, and finally understood. In his obsessive fear of being betrayed, he had become the betrayer. He had sought a woman of unimpeachable integrity, and upon finding her, had proven he himself possessed none. He had wanted a nurse for his daughter, but he had destroyed his chance with the only woman who could have healed them both. He knew an apology sent by messenger would be meaningless. Words on paper could not mend what he had broken. He had to tear down the walls of his own making, the title, the wealth, the pride. One storm-swept evening, he did the unthinkable. He rode not to the village doctor or the magistrate, but to her. He arrived at her tiny cottage on foot, his fine clothes soaked, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, looking less like a Marquis and more like a penitent. She opened the door and stared, her expression guarded. He did not try to enter. He stood on her doorstep, letting the rain wash over him, a pathetic and inadequate baptism. "I have no right to be here," he began, his voice raw and broken. "I have no excuse for what I did. I was a coward. I was so terrified of letting anyone close to my daughter, to me, after my wife died. The scar," he touched his face, "it's not from the war. It's from the carriage accident. The one that took her from me and stole my daughter's voice. I hid behind my grief, and I used it as a weapon to test you. I am sorry, Ilara, for the lie, for the insult, for the pain I caused you." He reached into his coat and pulled out not a purse of gold, but the small, carved bird from the nursery. He held it out to her. "This is not a gesture of a Marquis. It is the plea of a father, of a man who has been a fool." His voice cracked. "Widowed Marquis hired a nurse for the night, and woke wanting her name. I woke wanting to know everything about the woman who showed my broken world a glimmer of light. I don't want a nurse, Ilara. I want you." As if on cue, a small figure appeared from behind him, huddled under his cloak. It was Rosalie. She looked at Ilara, her large gray eyes filled with a child's desperate hope. She stepped forward, took the wooden bird from her father's hand, and held it out to Ilara. Then, the miracle Alistair had given up on finally happened. In a tiny, hesitant whisper that was nonetheless the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, Rosalie spoke her first word in over a year. "Stay." Tears Ilara had refused to shed in her own sorrow now fell freely for the child, for the broken man before her, for the fragile hope that stood trembling in the rain. She looked at Alistair, truly seeing the man stripped of all artifice, and saw not the beast of Blackwood, but a soul laid bare. She took the bird from Rosalie's hand and gently led them both inside, out of the storm. A year later, the sun shone brightly on the gardens of Blackwood Manor. The oppressive silence was a distant memory, replaced by the sound of a child's bright laughter as she chased a butterfly across the lawn. Ilara, now the Marchioness, stood beside her husband, her hand resting on his arm. The scar on his face remained, a map of a painful past, but it no longer defined him. His eyes, when they looked at her, were filled with a light and love she had once thought impossible. He lifted her hand, the capable, chapped hand of a village healer, and pressed it to his lips. Their love had not been born of convenience or title, but forged in the fires of deception and redeemed by the humbling power of truth. It was a love that had bridged a chasm of class and grief, a quiet, triumphant love that had healed a man, saved a child,